is April 21, 2024. We are now on our second day of Rizwan. Hopefully everyone is having a happy celebration of this king of festivals. We are here to welcome all of you for this next session in the series for The Guardian. Now, The Guardian is a session that you can find on Clearwater Baha'is, the YouTube channel, and on the Baha'i Center for Clearwater. You're more than welcome to watch the previous episodes in this series. Without much further ado, let's introduce Miss Violetta. Violetta is an artist and graphic designer living in Pointe-Noire in the Republic of Congo. And she is the co-founder with Adib Musumian of the Utterance Project. Violetta is also a researcher, a writer, and a presenter on Baha'i history. She has given over 50 talks on the Clearwater Baha'is YouTube channel and is the author of 4 online illustrated chronologies on the lives of Bahá'u'lláh, the Bab, Abdu'l-Bahá, and Shoghi Effendi. All links and details can be found in the description below in this video. With that being said, welcome, Violetta. We're so happy to have you. I cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
I'm so sorry. I was going to say thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I want to just explain something real quick. This is a chronology. It's not thematic like the Priceless Pearl. In the Priceless Pearl, Ruhiya Khanum starts chronologically the life of the Guardian until he becomes the Guardian, and then she breaks the book up in thematic sections. The Guardian's writings, the Guardian's development of the administrative order, the Guardian's building of edifices on Mount Carmel, the Monument Gardens, and all these types of things. She even has a chapter with her own diary entries. What I've done is different. I have taken all of that information and I have organized it chronologically. So please don't be dismayed or confused or surprised if we go from martyrdoms to the pilgrimage of Mary Maxwell in this part, or from the Queen of Romania to the problems in Baghdad. The chronological aspect means that from this section onwards, there are not going to be that many thematic sections. It's going to be events in the life of the Guardian that he has to deal with that are chronological, and it's going to give you a sense of the variety of things that he had to deal with on a daily basis. So you're going to see this in the first 4 stories of this part. And now let me know, you can see my screen? Yes? Okay, wonderful. Great. The Guardian Part 7, 2 years in the life of Shoghi Effendi, 1925 to 1927, Queen Marie of Romania. This part covers the life of Shoghi Effendi from the age of 28 in 1925 to the age of 30 in 1927. And we start with a little story called Effie Baker, Hostess of the Western Pilgrim House, 16 to 27 January 1925. This is an important section because I want to introduce you completely to Effie Baker, who's going to be very, very important because she is the woman who will go to Persia and take 1,000 pictures of all of the places in Persia that are holy places, sacred places, places where the Babis were martyred, all of those pictures that you see in the Dawnbreakers. She's the one who took most of those. So I didn't want to introduce her in 1931, just point blank. I wanted you to know who she was before I brought that up. The first story, however, doesn't have to do with Effie Baker. The first story is 16 January 1925. We return to Iraq with the Most Great House of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad. On the 16th of January 1925, Shoghi Effendi reported that the Shia had first taken the case of the Most Great House of Baha'u'lláh to their religious court. It was then sent to the peace court. It was brought before the local court of first instance, and they decided in favor of the Baha'is. But 10 months later, in November 1925, the decision of the court of first instance was taken to another court. So this is like 3 or 4 courts already. The Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court of Iraq. And they ruled in favor of the Shia. So Shoghi Effendi sent a distressing cable to the Baha'i world saying, Iraq Supreme Court unexpectedly pronounced verdict against us in Baghdad. Strongly advise national and every local assembly communicate by cable and letter with Iraq High Commissioner, appealing ardently for action to ensure the security of Baha'u'llah's sacred house. This crisis would go on and on. And a few days later, the custodian was evicted from the Most Great House. And then a month later, Shoghi Effendi received more distressing news that the keys of the House of Bahá'u'lláh were given to the Shia. And so the Guardian showed his brilliant strategic side in asking the Baha'i world to unite in action. And this is the first sort of world campaign that is sort of spearheaded by the Guardian and the Holy Land, and rallying the entire world Baha'i community to petition and to send letters to their governing bodies and to Iraq. And so Iraq would be getting these cables from all these communities they would never have heard of before. And he told them what language to use, specific turns of phrases to include, but also not to send identically worded messages. So you see the strategy of Shoghi Effendi in dealing with this. This is not the end of this. We're going to revisit this later. There are a lot of quotes in here that I have not read, which you can find on the website. And now I want to introduce you to Effie Baker, this really extraordinary woman. This is only 3 days after the initial cable that the Guardian received about the Most Great House. Effie Baker comes on her second pilgrimage. Effie Baker was the second Australian Baha'i. She was a professional photographer, and she had gone on pilgrimage in January of 1925, and on her second pilgrimage in January of 1925, following a pilgrimage 6 months earlier in August of 1925. And the ladies of the Holy Family loved Effie Baker so much, they asked her to stay. So she stayed for a few weeks. She was not really sure of her immediate plans. And Shoghi Effendi returned to the Holy Land from his annual vacation in Switzerland, or rest and recuperation is more accurate than vacation. And he he asked her to stay. He said, Effie, he had originally said that she could leave, and then he said, Effie, I have reconsidered my decision. I'm going to keep you here. And Shoghi Effendi would later describe Effie in a letter to Hyde and Clara Dunn, the mother and father of the Australian Baha'i community, as a beloved and devoted sister, and her diligent and heroic pioneer efforts in that vast continent. And he was so glad to welcome her to Haifa. And she's going to be in Haifa for several years. And what she's going to be doing in Haifa before she goes on her photographic adventure for the Dawnbreakers is she is the hostess of the Western Pilgrim House. And I want to describe to you a little bit what that means, because we don't often think that there was a hostess for the Western Pilgrim House. And it's actually a lot of duties that she performed. When the Western Pilgrim House, which you see here in the photograph, was finally built, and it was finally ready for use about in the first half of 1926, Effie Baker started assuming the duties of the hostess, and she had to make sure it was habitable. Electricity was installed at the end of September 1926. So that was much easier for Effie because she didn't have to constantly be cleaning those kerosene lamps. And she made the Guardian had added an additional 8 rooms to this pilgrim house because it had become very clear towards the end of the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá that there were so many Western pilgrims coming. They needed their own Western pilgrim house. So it was towards the end of Abdu'l-Bahá's ministry that plans started being put into motion to build it. But it was finished in the first 4 years or 5 years of the Guardian's ministry. Effie Baker really suffered from the heat in the Holy Land. but it was more than compensated by the greatest honor of her life, which was to be at the side and in the presence of Baha'u'llah's only daughter, the greatest holy leaf, the sister of Abdu'l-Bahá. The food for the Western Pilgrim House was not cooked in the Western Pilgrim House. It was cooked in the master's house and brought across the street by Saichiro Fujita. And an Arab youth kept the food warm on this bright blue flamed stove. And it was Effie's job to inform Shoghi Effendi that the food was ready and the pilgrims were present and that dinner could begin. So then Shoghi Effendi would arrive. And during her service at the World Center, Effie Baker was so privileged to witness so many different things that she would write these beautiful, long, circular letters to Australia. And so we get an idea that the information was, and obviously, if she was writing these letters and disseminating them, she most definitely had the permission of the Guardian to do this. But when she arrives in the Holy Land, another thing happens. Is that between 1925 and 1931, she's going to be taking pictures of the holy places. And these pictures you're going to see in volumes 3 and 4 of the Baha'i World. And Shoghi Effendi called Effie Baker assistant photograph editor of the Baha'i World. So you can see these pictures are from everywhere, from the inside of the holy shrines to Bahji, to the House of Aboud, to archives, to just a variety, the inside of the mansion of Bahji. Shoghi Effendi was himself a talented photographer, and he also took pictures that were published in the Baha'i World. He is the one who took the 1919 photograph of the Monument of the Greatest Holy Leaf that appears as the frontispiece of Baha'i World Volume 5. So he had his only real hobby was photography, so he took a very great interest in photographs published in the Baha'i World. And these photographs between 1925 and 1931 are the ones that Effie Baker took, are the first comprehensive and sustained photographic documentation of the Baha'i holy places that we have from a single photographer. And she coincidentally arrived the very first year that Shoghi Effendi was preparing the first volume of the Baha'i World. The cameras that she used at first was a Kodak A1 autographic camera called also a Kodak Junior. It was a folding camera for 120 film. And she also had a plate camera and an autofocus enlarger. So she was a serious photographer. She was technically gifted, and all of that would come into great use when she was all alone in Persia taking pictures. February to May 1925, the International Baha'i Bureau. This is outside of the Baha'i Bureau in Geneva, Switzerland, and these are the original members. Jean Stannard was a steadfast Baha'i from the time of Abdu'l-Bahá. She was fluent in French and Persian, and she'd been pioneering for years in Egypt. In February of 1925, she came on pilgrimage to Haifa and consulted with Shoghi Effendi about where she could move to after Egypt, somewhere in Europe. She was thinking of going to Lausanne in Switzerland, but Shoghi Effendi immediately replied, Geneva. Jean Stannard was surprised, but she moved to Geneva. And at the time, Geneva was the hub of international organizations, and she quickly integrated in that world. She was a woman of many talents. And soon after her arrival, she established what was called the International Baha'i Bureau. The vision of Shoghi Effendi for the International Baha'i Bureau was a communications hub between Baha'i groups and communities worldwide. And Martha Root, Shoghi Effendi's star servant, soon joined the Bureau. She would organize the Esperanto Congresses of 1925 and 1926 in the Bureau's offices, and events at which Lydia Zamenhof, the daughter of the creator of Esperanto, first learned of the faith. So this is now the beginning of international organizations. So little by little, incrementally, sustainably, Shoghi Effendi is increasing the Baha'i presence on the world stage. The next story is a little bit unusual. I have two stories like this in the chronology, and I chose to use both of them, and I'll tell you why. This is the first secular portrait of Shoghi Effendi, which means the first portrait of the guardian, our beloved guardian, by a person who is not a Baha'i. And I think it's very interesting because the things that she sees in Shoghi Effendi are kind of interesting. This is Lady Dorothy Mills, and this is her book, Beyond Bosphorus, and highlighted here is the sections where she speaks about Shoghi Effendi. The second one, the second portrait by a non-Baha'i is going to take place in 1938, so quite a few years later. She was well-born. She was the daughter of Robert Horace Walpole, the fifth and final Earl of Orford. So she was British aristocracy in a sense. She was the first Western woman to travel to Timbuktu in Western Africa, in Mali. And then she traveled in the Middle East and traveled to British Mandate Palestine and met Shoghi Effendi on a blazing hot day. And she described him as a most charming man, looking about 30, small, slight-featured, Persian in his general appearance, dressed in sober black robes with composed and courteous manner. He seems to talk every known language and spoke to me with willing fluency and convictions of the aims of his movement. She loved the gardens, and she noticed how stark difference the gardens were to the rest of the landscape in Haifa. And Shoghi Effendi spoke to her for 2 hours on the Baha'i teachings, and she took meticulous notes. And she really liked the Baha'is. She left with a very positive view of the Baha'i faith and the Baha'is. And this is just a wonderful, wonderful little story because Hand of the Cause Zikhrullah Khadem made his first pilgrimage after the 8th of May, 1925. And why this is so interesting is because Zikhrullah Khadem still has many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren alive today. So talking about him is a connection that we have that's a direct connection to Shoghi Effendi because his relatives are still alive. And I want to thank Dr. Khadem Khodadad for having read over my story here and provided some corrections. Jana Khadem Khodadad, thank you. So shortly after the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá in 1921-1922, the Central Spiritual Assembly of Persia advised the Baha'i community to express their loyalty to the Guardian. So it's a very important time in Baha'i history because the covenant had been passed on to Shoghi Effendi, and it was important for the Baha'is to adhere and to be protected by the covenant. Zikhrullah Khadem was 18 years old, and he obeyed, writing a letter to his beloved guardian and pledging his love and devotion. In response to his letter, the guardian wrote him back, and that was it for Zikhrullah Khadem for the rest of his life. He had an undying devotion for Shoghi Effendi, and his heart was so enkindled that the guardian's letter created in his heart an irrepressible desire to attain his presence. So after receiving that letter, the only thought in his mind was going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. His heart had been set on fire. Javidukt Khadem, Zikhrullah Khadem's later wife, described 3 years between the time Zikhrullah Khadem received his first letter from the Guardian and the time he arrived for his pilgrimage in 1925 as spiritual stages of longing in which he ardently prayed, and there was a torrent of emotion going through his soul. He had so much ardor, and he was waiting with so much anxiety. He was so eager for any news from the Holy Land. And one day, he was brought into a conversation with a Westerner at the customs office who had a sticker from Haifa on his suitcase. And his desire to go to Haifa just kept increasing. And one night, Zikhrullah Khadem made his pilgrimage to the shrine of Baha'u'lláh and to the presence of the beloved guardian. And he cried so much during his sleep that when he awoke, his pillow was drenched with tears. By 1925, the 21-year-old was so eager to go on pilgrimage that he applied and obtained for a passport with the help of a friend. And he met Haji Amin, the trustee of the Huququllah, hand of the cause, who encouraged him to write the guardian a letter requesting permission. But he was so in a hurry that he left Persia for Baghdad without receiving permission. Then from Baghdad, he left for Damascus, still not waiting for permission. Then he went to Beirut. Then he traveled by car over to Haifa and with a group of Europeans. And he was assailing the people in the car with questions about how much further are we? Are we there yet? How much further are we? Are we arriving? Are we close to Haifa? Blah, 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 blah. And so finally, they unceremoniously dumped him right in front of the house of Abdu'l-Bahá at 7 Haparsim. And then he realized, I don't have permission to be here. I haven't received permission. So as he was standing there, Dr. John Esslemont, the Guardian's secretary, and a Dutch pilgrim saw him from the window of the Western Pilgrim House, and they went out to welcome him. One of the Baha'is recognized Zikhrullah Khadem and immediately handed him his letter of permission for pilgrimage that had been prepared that very day and that was about to be mailed to him. He had finally arrived on pilgrimage. And here are some of the highlights of this young, on fire, future hand of the cause, young Zikhrullah Khadem's pilgrimage. This photograph of Abdu'l-Bahá holding a rose is going to come into the story at the end of this vignette. Zikhrullah Khadem had a profound transformative experience with his pilgrimage. It would change the rest of his life. Entering into the presence of the guardian would transform him, and he would devote the next 6 decades of his life to service. Guardian encouraged Zikhrullah Khadem to share with the Persian youth his love and his encouragement, and to ask them to deepen themselves in the faith, to study English and English literature in particular. And Zikhrullah would be the very first to obey this advice from the guardian, and he would be a lifelong student of English. Zikhrullah Khadem was present in the Holy Land at the time when the guardian was completing the last 3 rooms of the original square shrine of the Bab. Abdu'l-Bahá had always envisioned 8 rooms for the original shrine. No, 9 rooms for the original shrine. And he had only been able to complete 6 of them. And so this was at the time that Shoghi Effendi was building the last 3 rooms to complete the original building as envisioned by Abdu'l-Bahá. And the guardian was very hands-on with this project, and he asked Zikhrullah to hold one end of the string while he poured plaster along the line of the string in order to mark where the rooms would be. Shortly before he left Haifa, Zikhrullah Khadem asked the guardian for his photograph. And in a gesture that is so typical of the humility of our beloved guardian, instead of giving him his own photograph, the guardian gave Zikhrullah Khadem a photograph of Abdu'l-Bahá holding a rose in his hand. And he told him, I give you a portrait of the beloved master as a souvenir. May to October 1925, Shoghi Effendi in his beloved Switzerland. This is Shoghi Effendi's 1925 summer retreat to Switzerland, and we see here a photograph of Shoghi Effendi by a glacier with a walking pole. Shoghi Effendi spent 5 months in Switzerland in 1925. He was by this point a very serious, very experienced hiker. And Interlaken, where he almost always stayed, was the starting point for countless exhilarating trails into the Bernese Alps. The views were stunning, spectacular. The mountains overlooked many lakes in the region. Shoghi Effendi would leave for his strenuous hikes before sunrise, wearing sturdy hiking boots, knee-length trousers, heavy black puttees, a strip of wool tightly wound around his calves, and a loose tweed jacket and a small, cheap canvas backpack. He would take a train to the foot of a mountain, any mountain, or pass, and he would begin his very long hike, walking 10 to 16 hours alone. Whenever any of his young family members tried to accompany him, they would never be able to stand the pace and would have to turn back, and he would go on alone. Shoghi Effendi shared his passion for walking with his beloved grandfather. Abdu'l-Bahá walked several times a day at a fast pace if he could during his journeys to the West, and often people tried to keep up with the 69-year-old, 71-year-old Abdu'l-Bahá, but very often even his younger companions could not stand the pace of Abdu'l-Bahá during his walks. Sometimes Shoghi Effendi climbed even higher mountains, but for these expeditions, he would be roped to a seasoned Swiss guide. The longest hike Shoghi Effendi ever completed was 42 kilometers over 2 mountain passes. Shoghi Effendi always hiked, even through inclement weather, and if he ever got caught in the rain, he would let himself get drenched and simply let his clothes dry on his back as he kept walking. May 10th, 1925 to early 1926, the annulled Egyptian marriages. I cannot overestimate how important this story is for Shoghi Effendi, for the Guardian, and for Baha'i history as a whole. This is a tremendously important story. And the reason is not what you may think, because it shows the Guardian's brilliance. So this is just a photograph of Beba, Egypt, that I found on Wikimedia Commons. Egypt was one of the very first countries in which the faith of Baha'u'lláh was established in his lifetime. In all Islamic countries, all matters pertaining to civil law were administered by religious courts. For several years, Hippolyte Dreyfus, the first French Baha'i, had met with and provided legal support to the Baha'is in Egypt, in the hopes that the Egyptian authorities would recognize the independent character of the Baha'i faith and allow Baha'is to refer their legal matters to independent tribunals instead of Muslim courts. Then everything changed in a small village in Upper Egypt. When the Baha'is of Kawamus Saudi formed their local spiritual assembly, the local fanatical tribal leader began stirring up mischief against 3 Baha'is, legally demanded that their Muslim wives divorce them on the grounds that Baha'is were now heretics to Islam. He was trying to cause trouble, and he was trying to oppose the Baha'is, so he just zeroed in on these 3 Baha'is who were married to Muslim women and started rousing public opinion, asking that their wives divorce them. That's the beginning situation. The case was sent to the appellate religious court of the district of Beba, which managed this village of Kawamus Saidi. The court, the appellate court, the religious court, Muslim court, delivered their judgment on the 10th of May, 1925, and they strongly condemned the 3 heretics for violating the laws and ordinances of Islam, and they annulled the marriages. They canceled the marriages. So outwardly, one would look at the situation and think, oh, poor Baha'is, this is a terrible situation for Baha'is, their marriages were annulled. But inwardly, this is not what happened. What outwardly had seemed for a defeat for the Baha'is was in fact a great victory in the eyes of the Guardian. What did the Guardian see in this situation that every other Baha'i didn't? How did the Guardian see this as a victory while other Baha'is think this is a failure, this is a defeat? For Shoghi Effendi, and this is a quote, this was the first charter of liberty emancipating the Baha'i faith from the fetters of Orthodox Islam. Let me explain. By declaring the three Baha'is heretics and annulling their marriages, the district religious court of Beba had in fact declared that the Baha'i faith is so different from Islam, is a religion independent of Islam. In the words of Shoghi Effendi, this is what happened. It even went so far as to make the positive, the startling, and indeed the historic assertion that the faith embraced by these heretics is to be regarded as a distinct religion wholly independent of the religious systems that have preceded it. This is the wording of the religious court. What they had done, in fact, is not annul three Baha'i marriages, was declare the independent character of the Baha'i faith. The formal verdict listed the fundamental principles and laws of Islam. The formal verdict gave a detailed list of the Baha'i teachings from the Kitab-i Aqdas, the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and those of Mirza Abul Fazl, and it demonstrated that the three defendants had given up Islam upon becoming Baha'is. The verdict itself, and now this is from the verdict of the Beba court, declared in the most unequivocal terms, the Baha'i faith is a new religion, entirely independent, with beliefs, principles, and laws of its own, which differ from and are utterly in conflict with the beliefs, principles, and laws of Islam. No Baha'i, therefore, can be regarded as a Muslim or vice versa, even as no Buddhist, Brahmin, or Christian can be regarded as a Muslim or vice versa. A year later, the Guardian would revisit the situation in Egypt, and this Beba verdict would go down in Baha'i history. And he would use this verdict even 20 years later in defense of the faith as a proof that the faith is independent, as stated by a Muslim religious court of a Muslim country. Now, this is a very short vignette, but I found it really, really important as a historian. A lot of the sources that we have that are the most valuable are autobiographies of famous Baha'is from the heroic age, and also stories, biographies of cities. There is available in Persian. You have no idea the wealth of Baha'i history that is available in Persian. There is a compilation of 99 biographies of the 99 most eminent believers from Persia that exists, that is not translated in English. And each of these biographies is between 40 and 100 pages long. There are dozens upon dozens of Baha'i biographies of cities like Yazd and Hamadan. And I have been in love with these sources for years. And then I realized the reason they exist is because Shoghi Effendi asked these people to write them. Here are 4 Baha'i historians: Fazil Mazindarani, Haji Muhammad Tahiri Malmiri, Hassan Fuadi Bushrui, Sadri Nawab Zaki Ardekani. 3 short years after the beginning of his guardianship, Shoghi Effendi's lifelong dedication to preserving the precious history of the Baha'i faith had already been put in place, and it already had his strategy. From the very beginning of his ministry, Shoghi Effendi encouraged the Baha'is of Persia to compile the history of the faith in their cities and their regions. and he asked them to gather historical information on events during the formative age. On the 25th of October, 1925, Shoghi Effendi wrote a letter to the Central Assembly of Tehran, stating that he hoped these histories would soon be completed and disseminated. As a result of the Guardian's encouragement, prominent local Baha'is wrote series of local Baha'i histories in the late 1920s and early 1930s on provinces such as Azerbaijan, Khorasan, and Gilan, and on cities such as Isfahan, Hamadan, Yazd, and Shahmirzad, and smaller communities such as Milan, Neiriz, Abadeh, Sangsar, Nur, and some of the villages around Yazd. And this work, what is extraordinary about it is that it was completed after the time of the Guardian into today. We still have people today writing histories on small villages in Iran. And this was all spearheaded by the Guardian. On the 22nd of November, 1925, Shoghi Effendi's dear collaborator, John Ebenezer Esslemont, passed away. He was only the Guardian's English secretary for about a period of 1 year. Actually, exactly 1 year, because he started in November 1924, and he died suddenly and very unexpectedly from complications of his tuberculosis. Shoghi Effendi sent heartfelt condolences to Dr. Esslemont's family. Overwhelmed with sorrow at passing dearly beloved Esslemont, all devoted efforts unavailing, be assured of heartfelt sympathy, condolences myself and Baha'is world over. Letter follows. I love that. He did not waste one moment sending his condolences to the family. And these last two words, letter follows, just so much kindness in the Guardian. He would write them a lovely, wonderful, heartfelt letter, pouring his heart out about how much he loved Dr. Esslemont, and added in this letter that his masterpiece, Bahá'u'lláh and the New Era, quote, would inspire generations yet unborn. Shoghi Effendi retained a love for Bahá'u'lláh and the New Era until the end of his life. He loved that book and had it translated into hundreds of languages by the end of his ministry. He described Dr. Esslemont as the warmest of friends, a trusted counselor, an indefatigable collaborator, a lovable companion. The Guardian wept for days, and he immediately cabled England, America, Germany, Persia, and India to hold memorial gatherings for Dr. Esslemont and to cable their condolences to Esslemont relatives, none of whom were Baha'is. He would be the very first hand of the cause raised by the Guardian posthumously. Two months after the passing of Dr. Esslemont in late January 1926, the Guardian sent Hippolyte Dreyfus, the first French Baha'i, who had a PhD in law, and Mountfort Mills, a very well-known American international lawyer, to Egypt. He gave them instructions to plead with the Egyptian authorities for the national legitimization of the local verdict. So what he was asking them to do was basically take the Beba verdict that we looked at in detail a couple of sections earlier and expand it from Beba to the rest of Egypt, so that all of Egyptian Muslim courts would have the same language in saying that the Baha'i Faith is an independent religion, just like Buddhism, just like Hinduism, just like Christianity, just like Judaism. So by the end of January 1926, they were both in Cairo, and they met with the Prime Minister, the Minister of the Interior, and the British High Commissioner and his advisor. And they were received with great courtesy. And Hippolyte Dreyfus was a master diplomat. So he was of great, great help in these meetings. And they used the Beba court's judgment and published a compilation of Baha'i laws relating to the matter of personal status, marriage, divorce, inheritance, things like that. The Guardian had seized this Beba verdict, this powerful new, not weapon, but this new card that he could use for the defense of the faith. And he wanted this to be accepted by all Muslim courts everywhere. This was outwardly, these divorces, these annulled marriages became a badge of honor. And the Guardian would consider the Beba district a badge of honor until the day he died. He used it shortly before his passing as well in Israel. The compilation on Baha'i laws was translated into Persian. It was covered. It was used as a guide for running affairs in countries which lacked civil laws to cover such civil matters. And again, in 1926, the Guardian spoke about the Beba verdict, saying that this decision, however locally embarrassing, in the present stage of our development, may be regarded as an initial step taken by our very opponents in the path of the eventual universal acceptance of the Baha'i Faith as one of the independent, recognized religious systems of the world. And now for the title of this part. 26 to 30 January 1926, Queen Marie of Romania discovers the Baha'i Faith. And this is Queen Marie of Romania's ancestor, Queen Victoria. In the Kitabi Ahdas, verse 84, Baha'u'lláh said, "How great the blessedness that awaiteth the king who will arise to aid my cause in my kingdom, who will detach himself from all else but me. Such a king is numbered with the companions of the crimson ark, the ark which God hath prepared for the people of Baha." Here is Martha Root. And between the 26th and the 28th of January, 1930, Martha Root is going to try and attempt to obtain an interview with Queen Marie of Romania, and she is very determined. Queen Marie was the beloved queen of Romania. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria and the Russian Tsar Alexander II, two monarchs which had not only been directly addressed by Baha'u'lláh with tablets addressed to each of them, but they also, both of them, had not turned away from him the way Napoleon, for example, had, who spoke very insultingly about the tablet of Baha'u'lláh. So she was descended from from a king and from a czar and a queen who had not rejected Baha'u'lláh. Martha Root had arrived in Romania on the 26th of January, 1926, and she had this firm personal conviction that even a queen deserved to know about Baha'u'lláh. So she had a daily speaking schedule. Everywhere she went, she always had a daily speaking schedule with Esperantists. And then on top of that, she was writing articles about various things in the city. But she planned to leave in early February, and she was really desperate to meet the queen before she left. So she contacted the queen's lady-in-waiting and the American ambassador, who told her flat out, "You can't see the queen." Martha refused to be defeated. On the 28th of January, 1926, she sent Queen Marie a letter directly, and she enclosed a photograph of Abdu'l-Bahá, and she enclosed a copy of Dr. Esslemont's Baha'u'lláh and the New Era. The next day, 29th January, 1926, Martha Root's invitation. This is a photograph of Controceni Palace in Bucharest, Romania. It was originally built as a monastery in the 17th century, and it was rebuilt in 1893, and Queen Marie renovated the north wing of the palace, and this is where they're going to meet. The next day, the 29th of January, 1930, Martha Root received an invitation to visit the queen at Controceni Palace outside Bucharest on the following day, the 30th. Martha Root was absolutely overjoyed. She had no money. She never had any money. She was always pinching pennies. And she prepared a very, very, very humble gift to bring to Queen Marie. She had a greatest name. She had a copy of the Seven Valleys. She gave her 2 Esperanto books. She gave her an Esperanto pin that belonged to her. She gave her a small bottle of cheap perfume, a little box containing a piece of chocolate wrapped in gold foil, a branch of white lilacs, and a report of the Education Congress in Edinburgh, because Queen Marie had been Princess of Edinburgh before getting married. 30th of January, 1926, Martha Root meets Queen of Romania. What an absolutely stunning woman. On the 30th of January, 1926, Martha arrived at the palace wearing her long white dress, and the doors swung open. She met a lady in waiting who led her up a spiral staircase, and she arrived at Queen Marie's drawing room. The queen walked briskly towards Martha, smiling in her blue silk dress, briefly greeted her, and then said, "I believe these teachings are the solution for the world's problems today." Queen Marie had stayed up until 3 in the morning reading Baha'u'lláh and the New Era, and she found the principles of the faith very interesting. She asked Martha to tell her about the cause and asked a number of questions, and she also gave Martha the name and the address of a dear friend of hers in Vienna, whom she encouraged her to visit. The meeting was deeply intimate. They confided in each other and spoke about world issues. They talked about manners and morals. They talked about religions and prejudice, Esperanto and education. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Martha Root would have 8 more interviews with Queen Marie. (1926), the Jahrum martyrdoms and the Maraghih persecutions. But before we talk about these martyrdoms and persecutions, something else begins in 1926 that's going to be the affair of 2 decades. It is the contribution of George Townshend to the Bahá'í Faith. This is George Townshend, the Irish future hand of the cause. And this is the inside of the church that he worked in. He was a deacon for this church in Dublin. He was an Irish Anglican clergyman who became a Baha'i in 1918 after beginning correspondence with Abdu'l-Bahá. He did not officially sever his church with his ties with the Anglican Church until he was 79 in 1946. George Townshend was a very, very gifted writer, and he was well known, actually. And he assisted Shoghi Effendi with the editing of his English translations and with his original manuscript of God Passes By. So from 1926 to 1944, George Townshend contributed his editorial skills to all of Shoghi Effendi's major letters and translations. A perfect example of the nature of the collaboration between the Guardian of the Faith and George Townshend is illustrated in the way Shoghi Effendi describes it himself in a letter he sent to George on the 1st of May, 1926. This is Shoghi Effendi speaking in a letter. "I am taking the liberty of forwarding you some of my recent translations. And if you feel that you would like to reshape and reconstruct the whole sentence, or bring about a fundamental change in the expression of the thought in some passages, please do not hesitate. I would greatly value your opinion as to the standard of English represented by these recent renderings, and would appreciate your detailed comment, criticism, and suggestion." This is the guardian of the Baha'i Faith. He's been the guardian of the Baha'i Faith for 5 years now. He's 29 years old. He has grown in confidence, and yet he speaks to this Irishman he has not yet ever met in person as a peer in terms of English, because he recognizes that George Townshend has such a superior skill in English compared to other people, that he is the only person that he would really collaborate with on that level. There are very few people in the world that Shoghi Effendi would ever collaborate with on the level of George Townshend. George Townshend received translations and simply touched them up. Really, he just tuned them here and there. He made valuable, detailed, and careful, and very sensitive suggestions, always extremely cordial, extremely polite and courteous to Shoghi Effendi. And his contribution was only limited to the English. He had absolutely no knowledge of Persian or Arabic. But he had also an excellent intuition and judgment. And The Guardian once described what he did as Englishing his work. Englishing. This collaboration between George Townshend and Shoghi Effendi is one of the most beautiful stories of partnership in the history of the faith. It's that of a Baha'i assisting the head of the faith with unbending loyalty, immense capacity, deep knowledge, such humility, and a heart and mind filled with love of Baha'u'lláh to the end. However, while all of this is happening, Shoghi Effendi is desperately searching for a capable secretary 1 year after the passing of John Esslemont. He writes to Horace Hawley and he says, "I have often felt the extreme desirability of having a collaborator like you working at my side here in Haifa." He talks about the oppressive burden of his responsibility, the unceasing toil, afflictions, and perplexities, the thorny path, the arduous duties. "I am alone at present, and I am doing the very best I can." He is just overworked and he's doing everything himself. And he writes, I'm not going to read them because they're all in a very similar vein, but look at how many quotes there are about how much he needs someone at his side. What he needs is close, continuous collaboration. "I am alone at present. All other matters are at a standstill." There's so much. This is definitely something that I encourage you to go back to the chronology. The link to the chronology will be in the liner notes of the YouTube video, but I must advance if I am going to tell you the whole story tonight. We return to the most great house of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad, and we return to our very dear friends, Mountford Mills, this very tall man. You see how small Fujita was next to him? Isn't that lovely? He's at least 1, 2, 3 heads taller than Fujita. And Hippolyte Dreyfus. So in 1926, Hippolyte Dreyfus and Mountford Mills, the international law team of the Baha'i, of the Guardian, are asked to come to Haifa to consult on this highly confidential case. And the case is the case of the Most Great House. They are going to use their considerable legal skills to advise the Iraqi Baha'is in the preparation of their files and the presentation of their cases. But unfortunately, in November 1926, Shoghi Effendi hears that the highest tribunal has ruled against the Baha'is. So they're appealing, but they decide to do something different this time. And they are planning to bring the case to the attention of the League of Nations in Geneva. And so the story is to be continued. 1926, Shoghi Effendi and the Trees of Richard St. Barbe Baker. This is the book that, this is the journal that St. Barbe wrote, the Journal of the Men of Trees. So the Men of Trees was an organization that St. Barbe Baker was passionate about trees. He worked as a logger in Saskatchewan, and then he just changed his mind completely about cutting down trees and wanted to start planting them. So he started in Kenya, and he started this organization called Watu Wamiti, which means the Men of Trees. And he turned the name into English, and he had his whole organization, and he was just devoted to reforestation. And he made a trip to, he attended the London conference that we saw in part 5, I think, or 6, in September, October 1924, Some Living Religions Within the British Empire. And he met Baha'is for the first time there. Then in 1926, he went to Haifa, and he went to pay his respect to Shoghi Effendi, who greeted him very warmly and who handed him an application for membership for life to the Men of the Trees organization. So our beloved guardian was a member for life of an organization called the Men of the Trees. And Shoghi Effendi was the very first member of that organization in Palestine. Shoghi Effendi promised St. Barb Baker that he would do much more than just apply for membership. And it was thanks to Shoghi Effendi's efforts and his enthusiastic endorsement that all of the heads of religion in Palestine also joined the Men of the Trees organizations, Muslim, Jews, and Christians. Shoghi Effendi and St. Barb Baker would remain close for many, many years. And 30 years later, Shoghi Effendi would call on St. Barb Baker to help African Baha'is attend the 1953 Intercontinental Teaching Conference. Long friendship with a very early pioneer in ecology. 7th of April, 1926, the 12 Martyrs of Jahrum. This is a letter in Persian from the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada to Reza Shah, appealing for justice. On the 7th of April, 1926, 12 Baha'i adults and a 16-month-old baby were savagely martyred in Jahrúm, Persia, a city 160 kilometers southeast of Shiraz. The instigator of the brutal murders was Ismail Khan Salwatul-Dawleh, a chief of the Qashqai tribe and the deputy for Jahrum, who was trying to prevent his defeat in elections and was looking to boost his popularity by basically savagely murdering innocent people. Fuad Rahani, a Baha'i in Tehran, described the ferocity and violence of the attack based on a report he received from the local spiritual assembly of Jahrum. The murders were carried out on the 7th of April by a Sayyid Muhammad and 3 others. No one complained, no one stopped them. The 4 aggressors beat 4 more Baha'is. They beat Baha'i women and children. They pummeled to death any Baha'i they found in Jahrum. They set on fire 20 Baha'i homes. And the Guardian received a cable from Shiraz announcing the atrocities. Shoghi Effendi immediately replied to that cable the same day, saying, horrified, sudden calamity, suspend activities, appeal central authorities, convey relatives tenderest sympathy. On the 12th of April, 1926, a day after the martyrdom, the chief instigator was arrested, and Shoghi Effendi sent a cable to the National Spiritual Assembly of Persia, asking them to convey to the Shah his profound appreciation for his swift intervention. Shoghi Effendi was very distressed by these martyrdoms, and he asked Baha'i National Spiritual Assemblies to publicize the event, but refrain from contacting the Persian government. Shoghi Effendi was reaching the point where he was too tired to work, and it was time for him to regain his strength. He felt he was becoming inefficient, and he would only last 1 more month before he had to go to Switzerland to rebuild himself. But he managed to see the situation with the infallible eyes of the Guardian in a very profound excerpt from a letter he wrote on the 21st of May, 1926, which states, I feel that with patience, tact, courage, and resource, we can utilize this development to further the interests and extend the influence of the cause. Because if Baha'is are going to be murdered savagely when they're innocent, then what other recourse do we have than to use this persecution to plead our case? That was the Guardian's unassailable strength. Blow after blow that he received, but he still was able to see how to fight back. That was the strength of the Guardian. Before the 11th of May, 1926, the Maraghih persecutions. This is a view of the beautiful countryside of Maraghih. In May 1926, there was a very severe persecutions for Baha'is in this area. They were banned to use public baths. They were banned to interact with Muslim merchants. They were constantly abused. All trees belonging to Baha'is, especially fruit trees, were felled. Water was withheld from irrigation for Baha'i lands. They refused to provide Baha'is with drinking water. They deprived Baha'is of any recourse to law. They banned Baha'is from properly burying their dead. And on a letter dated 11th of May, 1926, the Guardian expressed his dismay at the persecutions. Every appeal made by these Baha'is on behalf of their brethren, whether living or dead, has been met with cold indifference, with vague promises, and not infrequently with severe rebuke and undeserved chastisement. And as I explained in my introduction, right after these Maraghih persecutions, we have this very joyful story about Mary Maxwell's second pilgrimage, April to 23rd of May, 1926. And this is really interesting because Mary Maxwell is coming alone. Her parents are encouraging her independence. So she boards this ship, the RMS Mauritania, and she journeys to the Holy Land. And she arrives on the 12th of May, 1926. And this is Mary Maxwell's second pilgrimage. This is Mary Maxwell at 16 years old, 1 year older than she was when she came on pilgrimage at the age of 15. So you can just imagine she looks exactly like this on her second pilgrimage. She's in Haifa now, and Shoghi Effendi was ill when she arrived. He was in the state of utter burnout that Mary and May, her mother, had witnessed in 1923 when he had to leave for Switzerland. Mary had arrived at the same time of year as the Guardian, who had returned from Switzerland, nearly crushed to death by the pressures of his work and the covenant breakers. But his decline in health this year was precipitated by the 12 martyrs of Jahrum and the Maraghih persecutions. May Maxwell was such a well-known and universally admired Baha'i that Mary wrote to her to say something very, very, very sweet. She said, "I get at least 2 extra kisses from everyone just because I'm your daughter." The Guardian loved May Maxwell so much that his first words to Mary were about her mother, specifically about her health and if she was able to walk. And Munir Khanum, Abdu'l-Bahā's widow, sent May her love. To Munir Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, and the other older members of the Holy Family, Mary was the splitting image of May Bowles when she had first come on pilgrimage in 1898. Then a funny story. On the 16th of May, 1926, William Sutherland Maxwell could work a little more for the cause. This is a photograph of a young William Sutherland Maxwell in 1913. So you have to imagine him 13 years older than that. On the 16th of May, 1926, Mary Maxwell had a fascinating conversation with the Guardian, which is very indicative of her rare maturity and her dedication to the faith. After dinner, Mary Maxwell told Shoghi Effendi that she wished her father, William Sutherland Maxwell, would work a little more for the cause. Shoghi Effendi replied that her father was a Baha'i. Mary said, yes, but he might work a little more. The Guardian then lovingly joked that he hoped to see the husbands of formidable women, Mr. Maxwell, Mr. Smythe, and Mr. French, the husbands of May Maxwell, Daisy Smythe, and Nellie French, vying with their formidable wives for service in the cause. And then he said, this may happen. This may happen. On the 17th of May, 1926, Shoghi Effendi writes to May Maxwell about her daughter's pilgrimage. This is May Maxwell with her friend Juliet Thompson, beloved by Abdu'l-Bahá and her closest friend, probably. The day after his conversations about husbands vying for service with their famous Baha'i wives, Shoghi Effendi wrote a touching letter to May Maxwell about her daughter. The visit of your dear daughter Mary has reminded me of your sojourn in the Holy Land, the memory of which will ever linger in my mind. And he gives her advice. He says, "Let not the difficulties and disappointments overpower you. Remember my prayers and my love for you. My earnest hope is that Mary may follow in your footsteps and render memorable services to the cause you love so well." This is probably one of the first indications that we have in correspondence of the relationship between Shoghi Effendi and Mary Maxwell. Obviously, Mary Maxwell is a minor at this moment in her life. And Shoghi Effendi is a 30-year-old adult. And we know that they will be married in some 10 years' time, 11 years' time. But their relationship from this point forward is going to be anchored and is going to have as a pivot the covenant of Baha'u'lláh and service to the faith. From this moment forward, Shoghi Effendi's only relationship with this Mary Maxwell is how to help her serve better, how to help her serve more efficiently, where she should go, where she is needed. And that is the content of their correspondence for the next 11 years. It is absolutely focused on the guardian giving instructions to a soldier in the field. And her letters to him are just devotion, obedience, questions. Should I go here? Should I go there? Should I do this? Should I do this talk? Should I give this series of talks? And this story will continue in 1937, in 11 years' time. But before we finish, there's just one last thing. This is Mary Maxwell, a little younger than she was, just 1 year younger than she was when she came on pilgrimage. She's 14 in this picture. She's 15 when she's on pilgrimage. And before she leaves, Shoghi Effendi gives her advice on her studies. So she didn't just stay in Haifa. She spent 4 days in Tiberias, and she returned to Haifa for the commemoration of the ascension of Baha'u'lláh. The Guardian told her that she should find a very good Persian teacher. She should learn Persian. She should also get a good general education. And if her health permitted, she should study economics, sociology, or literature in university. Mary wrote to her mother that she wanted to study all three. You know, that passion, that spontaneity, that larger than life personality she had at 14, she's going to keep that when she's married to the Guardian. And after the Guardian's passing, that is the archetype of Mary Maxwell Ruhiya Khanum. That's who she is, that passionate person. At the age of 15, she is so dedicated to the Guardian that she writes to her mother and says, "If I could be an insect and crawl around after Shoghi Effendi, I would be very happy being." You know that the one thing that you always have to remember about Mary Maxwell and Ruhiya Khanum is, one, Shoghi Effendi is always her guardian first, even after they marry. Two, she has this irrepressible North American temperament and passionate and eagerness. And that eagerness she shares with Shoghi Effendi, whose main trait was his lifelong eagerness for knowledge and eagerness for perfection and eagerness for service and eagerness for sacrificing himself for the cause. Between the 4th and the 29th of May, 1926, Queen Marie of Romania writes several open letters. This is a photograph of Queen Marie of Romania behind the coat of arms of her family, Saxe-Coburg. This comes at a time when Shoghi Effendi is engulfed with troubles. And there are a lot of letters, and I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to read you 2 paragraphs from the first letter, and then I'm going to let you discover this on the chronology. Remember, the link to the chronology is always in the description of the videos below on YouTube, down here. This is her first open public letter to the people of the world, published in the Toronto Daily Star. "A woman brought me the other day a book. I spell it with a capital letter because it is a glorious book of love and goodness, strength and beauty. She gave it to me because she had learned I was in grief and sadness and wanted to help. She put it into my hands saying, You seem to live up to his teachings. And when I opened the book, I saw it was the words of Abdu'l-Bahá, prophet of love and kindness, and of his father, the great teacher of international goodwill and understanding, of a religion which links all creeds. Their writings are a great cry towards peace. It is a religion based on the inner spirit of God. This is a photograph of Queen Marie of Romania. Did I cut off her head? Uh-oh. Dressed in the national Romanian garb, distributing American Red Cross supplies to the needy children of Bucharest. Shoghi Effendi's response in a letter dated 29th of October 1926, he called it bold and repeated testimonies which Her Majesty Queen Marie of Romania has chosen to give the world. We truly recognize the evidences of the irrepressible power, the increasing vitality, the strange workings of a faith destined to regenerate the world. I want to just spend a little bit of time now talking about the relationship between Martha Root and Shoghi Effendi. This is, there will be several of these vignettes throughout the next parts, because I want you to get to know their collaboration a little bit more intimately. Martha Root was a journalist from a distinguished American family, and she met Abdu'l-Bahá in 1912, when Abdu'l-Bahá was visiting the United States. She was one of the very first people to rise up in 1919 when the Abdu'l-Bahá's tablets of the divine plan were unveiled. From the moment Shoghi Effendi became the guardian, Martha Root included Shoghi Effendi as a partner in all of her round-the-world travel teaching, always asking for his advice. She would say things such as, should I go here? Should I go there? Should I meet with this person? Should I travel here? Should I stay here? And she wrote to him absolutely constantly, and I'm not exaggerating. There were hundreds of cables between Shoghi Effendi and Martha Root. Shoghi Effendi would write to her also, and he told her, write me frequently and fully, for I yearn to hear of your activities and every details of your achievements, assuring you of my boundless love for you. She would reply and say, your letters have given me strength, joy, and encouragement at a time when I felt depressed, tired, and disheartened. Shoghi Effendi would openly admire her. He would say, generations yet unborn will exult in the memory of one who has so energetically, swiftly, and beautifully paved the way for the universal recognition of the faith of Bahá'u'lláh. They were full collaborators. They had a very spiritual relationship of mutual respect and encouragement. Martha Root would encourage Shoghi Effendi at times when he felt disheartened. Shoghi Effendi would encourage Martha Root at times when she felt depressed. She was deeply obedient. She was fully enkindled. She asked for his advice constantly and always followed his instructions to the letter. In this way, Shoghi Effendi was able to make use of her as a tool and of her considerable talents in fields as varied as the defense of the faith, teaching and proclamation, his representatives to international conferences to present his greetings to various royalty, such as the Queen of Romania, President Hoover, and His Imperial Majesty the Emperor of Japan. The next year, from May to October 1926, immediately after the pilgrimage of Mary Maxwell, Shoghi Effendi travels to Switzerland. And this is probably so it's late May 1926 to 15th October 1926. This is, I have to say, my favorite picture of all of the pictures of Switzerland. This is a photograph on the top of the mountain, Shoghi Effendi on the right, summiting one of the Swiss Alps with his guide. God, I love this picture so much. I think I'm actually going to frame it. By May 1926, Shoghi Effendi was worn out beyond imaginations. There were the Beba marriages. There was the saga with the House of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad. There was the Jahrúm martyrdoms. There was the Maraghih persecutions. So Over the next months, after all of these bad news, Shoghi Effendi worsened until his condition became so acute he had to leave the Holy Land for the Swiss Alps. And Shoghi Effendi wrote to Hippolyte Dreyfus, who was now working on the case of the Most Great House in Baghdad with Mountford Mills. In this letter Shoghi Effendi wrote him, he told Hippolyte, "In the fastness and recesses of its alluring mountains, I shall try to forget the atrocious vexations which have afflicted me for so long. It is a matter which I greatly deplore, that in my present state of health I feel the least inclined to and even incapable of any serious discussion of these vital problems." He was so exhausted and burnt out, he couldn't even talk. Shoghi Effendi left Haifa for Switzerland in late May, shortly after the commemoration of the Ascension of Baha'u'lláh, and in August he was joined by his mother Ziyaye Khanum and one of his sisters, and they all returned to the Holy Land on the 15th of October, 1926. 1926 to June 1927, Shoghi Effendi translates the hidden words. And we return briefly to the Western Pilgrim House in 1926. Amelia Collins and 7 other Baha'is gave the necessary funds to complete the Western Pilgrim House, and in December 1925, the Guardian expressed his heartfelt and abiding gratitude to them for allowing him to continue this construction project. In 1927, Shoghi Effendi added 8 bedroom suites to the building, and he adopted the custom of taking the evening meal with the Western Pilgrims in the dining room on the lower level. He usually met with the Eastern Pilgrims in the Eastern Pilgrim House and had tea with them after walking through the gardens with them, a stone's throw from the shrine of the Bab. 1921 to 1925, Shoghi Effendi's first 3 attempts at translating the hidden words. What you have here is an illuminated verse from the hidden words of Baha'u'lláh. It's one hidden word in Baha'u'llah's own handwritings, which were revealed in 1858 in Baghdad. And Baha'u'lláh opens the hidden words by explaining that these are a work of prophecy. These are a work that has been mentioned for 700 years in Islamic tradition as the hidden book of Fatimeh. They are words of consolation brought down from God by the angel Gabriel and given to Fatimeh, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, to console her heart after the death of her father. And they were revealed for the first time by Baha'u'lláh in 1858 in Baghdad, partly along the banks of the Tigris River and partly in the Most Great House. Shoghi Effendi began working on a translation of the hidden words. They were so important to him. You know, the hidden words are like a manual for living, how to behave, how to connect to the covenant, how to overcome difficulties, how to improve your character, how to forgive people, how to consider yourself, where your self-esteem should come from. All of the answers to these questions are in the hidden words, and they were extremely important to Shoghi Effendi because they're the first thing he ever tried to translate when he was in France at the Maison d'Hydrothérapie du Parc de Neuilly, recovering from his burnout from his 3 years as secretary to Abdu'l-Bahá. And they were also something he worked at while he was in Oxford, in between his courses, during his vacations. Shoghi Effendi described the hidden words as an outstanding contribution to the world's literature. It was very important for him to translate it perfectly. And he said that they occupied a position unsurpassed preeminence among the ethical writings of the author of the Baha'i dispensation, and that the hidden words constituted a dynamic spiritual leaven cast in the life of the world for the reorientation of the minds of men, the edification of their souls, and the rectification of their conduct. So he had sent a first translation of the hidden words to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada in 1923, and a revised translation in January 1925. But his final translation, the one that we know, was the one he made between the 27th of February 1926 until March 1927, with the assistance of two prominent literary Baha'is, Ethel Rosenberg from England and our beloved, adored, favorite George Townshend from Ireland. The Hidden Words, the story of a legendary literary partnership. You see the Guardian here and a young George Townshend here. Shoghi Effendi and George Townshend's 18-year literary partnership began on the 27th of February, 1927, with a letter from George Townshend. Aha, you thought it was going to be from a letter with Shoghi Effendi, but no, no, no. Listen to this. George Townshend had heard through the grapevine that Shoghi Effendi had invited Ethel Rosenberg to Haifa to help him with translation. So he wrote to Shoghi Effendi and said, you know, I'm available. I would like to do this too. And George Townshend was very well known, very talented Irish writer and former Anglican clergyman. He was just, he was an artist with English. His writing is so beautiful and so elegant. It's something that's just innate to him. In the letter that he wrote Shoghi Effendi, George Townshend gave examples of difficulties translating in English, such as the objective and subjective possessive cases, and gave examples of improved translations from the Guardian's previous translation attempts on the hidden words. Obviously, when the Guardian received this letter with these specific examples of the objective and subjective possessive cases and examples of how to make things better, he was absolutely overjoyed. He was exultant. George had been the literary partner he had been looking for, high and low, for years. And he replied on the 28th of March with the first batch of So the Guardian receives this letter of someone saying, hey, I want to help too. And, you know, I'm good. I'm good with English because look at these. I can make these sentences better. And this is why, because they're objective and subjective possessive cases. And the Guardian replies with a batch of translations for him to work on. See how effective the Guardian is? He doesn't write back and say, good, this is wonderful, I'll keep you posted. No, he just sends him a batch of corrections. So when George returned the last pages of the hidden words to Shoghi Effendi on the 7th of March, 1927, so between the 28th of March, 1926 and the 7th of March, 1927, there's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, just Shoghi Effendi sending George Townshend these packages of letters and George Townshend sending them back to Shoghi Effendi annotated, explaining why these changes had to happen. And they were always very courteous, very polite, and they were just as small changes as he could make them, tweaking just to make everything perfect. In the Guardian's words, Englishing the translation of the hidden words. And this is what George Townshend says in his last letter when he sends the last batches of pages that he's just corrected. There is a note, a music, a voice in the writings of Bahá'u'lláh, even in translations, which never was heard in English literature before, and which has such power that it seems to shake the air as one reads it. If other proof were lacking, this mighty voice would be proof enough. Literary people must all feel it. What George Townshend is describing is the fact that when you read the holy writings of Baha'u'lláh in English, you feel, honestly, you know that's not possible because you know Baha'u'lláh was a Persian nobleman and you know he revealed everything in Arabic and Persian. But a little part of you kind of feels like he revealed it in English as well because it's so perfect. That's what George Townshend was talking about. I love this. Oh, these are the hidden words written in Shoghi Effendi's exquisite calligraphy. The translation work done by Shoghi Effendi and the finishing touches brought by George Townshend consummated themselves in a literary masterpiece, The Hidden Words, a work of literary genius and beauty that never once reads like a translation. This is the impression also of Shoghi Effendi's former teacher in Beirut, Bayer Dodge. I realize how exceedingly difficult it is to translate beautiful Oriental thought into English, and I congratulate you for the quality of the language which you have used. This is the hidden word number 3 from the Arabic, just one of the 153 gems of brevity and mystical enlightenment in the matchless translation of Shoghi Effendi. O Son of Man, veiled in my immemorial being and in the ancient eternity of my essence, I knew my love for thee. Therefore I created thee, have engraved on thee mine image, and revealed to thee my beauty. In April 1927, shortly after finishing the hidden words, another great victory happens, and this time in the administrative order of the faith of Baha'u'lláh. This is the first declaration of trust by the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States. It is a great milestone of the formative age of the faith. The Guardian will congratulate the National Spiritual Assembly, worked on the fantastic work done by Mountford Mills. And this will be the first step in the unification of the Baha'i world community and the consolidation of the administrative order. This declaration of trust is going to be used by every other National Assembly with the bylaws. It's going to be we even today, we still use generations further that come from these initial bylaws and declarations. And when the House of Justice is formed, they will also have a declaration of trust and bylaws. June to November 1927, Shoghi Effendi in Switzerland. This is now the 3rd time in this part that Shoghi Effendi has gone to Switzerland, because he traveled in 1925, 1926, and 1927. This is another photograph of Shoghi Effendi and his bicycle by a glacier. Shoghi Effendi spent 5 months in Switzerland in 1927, between June and November. We don't have any really detailed accounts of his yearly stays in Interlaken, because he was mostly alone, sometimes with a family member, and no one was really writing about what he was doing day to day, but it was generally always the same thing: long hikes or mountain climbing up into his 30s with ropes and picks and things like that. But he finds himself over and over again in Switzerland, and thank God for Switzerland. Thank God Switzerland existed for Shoghi Effendi so that he could come back and keep doing his soul-crushing work. Year after year, he returned to the mountains to seek solace and recover strength that he would need for the coming 12 months. And every time, again and again, he found that Switzerland provided him with exactly what he needed: solitude, silence, and he could hike and walk and bike these breathtaking mountain passes. During his absence, Shoghi Effendi still contacts secular organizations. He writes a very long letter. This is Martha Root's long report regarding the 19th Universal Congress of Esperanto, which takes place while Shoghi Effendi is in his mountain retreat. And actually, one of the things about Shoghi Effendi is that he had a lot more contact with secular organizations than most Baha'is can imagine. He was held in high esteem by his non-Baha'i counterparts in religious and secular organizations around the world that shared some of the same ideals of the Baha'i faith. For example, in 1926, Sir Francis Younghusband invited Shoghi Effendi to the World Congress of Faith to pay all his travel expenses, and the Guardian, of course, was obliged to decline the invitation, but arranged for a Baha'i paper to be presented there. He also sent personal messages to the Universal Congress of Esperantists in 1927, in 1928, in 1929, in 1930, and in 1931, and probably other messages that we don't have records for. But Shoghi Effendi also, there was another aspect of his work, which was he wrote to crowned heads, and one of the crowned heads he wrote to often was Queen Marie of Romania. Queen Marie wrote to Shoghi Effendi on the 27th of August, 1926, with a very touching letter. She said, "Dear sir, I was deeply moved on reception of your letter," which means he had written to her prior to this. "Indeed, a great light came to me with the message of Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá. It came as all great messages come in an hour of dire grief and inner conflict and distress. So the seed sank deeply." And she talks about how she teaches the faith, With bowed head, I recognize that I too am but an instrument in greater hands and rejoice in the knowledge. Little by little, the veil is lifting, grief tore it in two, and grief was also a step leading me ever nearer the truth. Therefore, I do not cry out against grief. A long letter. You know what I'm going to say? You could go to the chronology to read the whole letter. While Shoghi Effendi was absent from the Holy Land, there was an earthquake in Haifa. And this is an image of the damage from the earthquake in 1927 on the 11th of July in Jericho. On Monday, 11th of July, 1927, an earthquake hit British Mandate Palestine at 3 p.m., causing widespread panic as people fled their collapsing homes. The earthquakes caused millions in damages and cost the lives of 500 people. Pope Pius was deeply grieved by the disaster in the Holy Land and instructed the Catholic Church to help with the relief effort. The earthquake razed 100 homes in Akka and caused devastation throughout the entire country. Effie Baker, the hostess of the Western Pilgrim House, had been preparing to weigh a baby at the Infant Welfare Center when she felt a rush of wind and felt herself swaying back and forth. The earthquake lasted about 10 seconds. The damage in Haifa was not nearly as severe as in other cities like Nablus, which felt the brunt of the impact and was badly damaged. We have come to the end of today's session, and I'm going to read you, there are two sections here in the chronology. Wait, hold on. Section 12 is Shoghi Effendi's character, and section 13 is Shoghi Effendi's guiding lines. So I'm going to just read a few of these to give you a taste of the Guardian, a little personal taste of the Guardian, but I really want you to go back to the chronology and read all of them because I chose every single one of them with so much care. They really are a complement to the chronology. They are undated, but they really tie everything together and give you a really good feel for who Shoghi Effendi was. And according to Ugo Giaccheri, who was his secretary in later life, Shoghi Effendi's faith was the core of the Guardian's personality and deeply rooted his soul. He said his whole being is permeated with the power of revelation, and this is the reason that all who come near him or in contact with him feel so safe, so assured, so regenerated. Shoghi Effendi was also a very generous person. Now, these are lilies of the valley. They were Shoghi Effendi's favorite flower. His favorite smell was jasmine, but his favorite flower was lily of the valley. And Shoghi Effendi was immensely, immensely generous. Ugo Giaccheri said, however, although his manners were reserved, an absolute condition for the prestige of his exalted rank, his heart was living, warm, pure, tender, noble, and generous. The warmth and love that emanated from his innermost being was like a magnet that attracted and subjugated all who came close to him. Sometimes the Guardian's gifts were so generous that people were absolutely astounded. For example, later in the chronology, much, much later in the chronology, he's going to give Abdu'l-Bahá's own wallet to Corinne True. And he was very generous to charitable causes. Ugo Giaccheri one day drove to Jerusalem to make a very large donation on behalf of Shoghi Effendi to the president of Hebrew University. Shoghi Effendi's integrity. Ruhiya Khanum stated that in the 20 years she shared Shoghi Effendi's life, she never saw Shoghi Effendi let anyone get away with anything. He was fully, his character was denoted integrity in its fullness. And it was, as Ruhiya Khanum described it, the integrity of the Guardian was diamond-like. One of the strongest characteristics of the Guardian was absolutely iron principle. Nothing could interfere with what he considered right. Nothing swayed him at all, neither love nor hate nor danger, absolutely nothing. It had no effect on him whatsoever. But another aspect of Shoghi Effendi's character was his reverence. And he was, I mean, after all, he was descended from the holy families of the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh. His great aunt was the greatest holy leaf. His grandmother was Abdu'l-Bahá's wife. And his reverence was obvious to everyone in the way that he walked, in the way he approached the shrines, in the way that he talked, in his silent acts, in his reverent manner. And this modern world that we live in does not have room for intangible things. It doesn't have room for things like reverence and the sacred. And this carried into all aspects of his life, even when people wanted to do a facsimile of a tablet in the handwriting of Baha'u'lláh to put on a brochure that might be crumpled and thrown in the garbage. The Guardian said, no, don't put a facsimile of Baha'u'llah's tablet on something that can be discarded. So his integrity, his reverence was just something that taught the Baha'is to become more reverent with him. He was also extremely humble. Ruhiya Khanum said, he was the humblest person I have ever met in my whole life. I have never in my life met a heart as humble as Shoghi Effendi's. He had not one speck of personal pride or conceit in his entire makeup. One day, Rafi Motahede was on pilgrimage in Haifa and was attempting to explain how much the Guardian meant to the Baha'is in the world. And the Guardian simply said, we are all servants of Baha'u'lláh. I am one of these servants. Ugo Giaccari said that the humility of the Guardian was of a kind not yet known elsewhere. And it was one of his many unique virtues, a humility which came from the conviction that man's faculties are not self-created, but are a precious trust from God to be displayed or used not to be displayed or used overbearingly or with vanity. Shoghi Effendi was also very gentle and very kind. He was always very worried about the friends. You know, if there was an earthquake, he would cable wire safety friends. Anxious earthquake, reports Persia, Turkestan. Then there was a consideration in him that extended to individual believers. There was a Baha'i who had a health issue, and he cabled the Baha'is in Egypt saying, "Dewing, New Zealand Baha'i arriving tonight, Cairo for one day. Urge, meet him at station. He wears helmet. If missed, meet him next morning. Cook's office, 9 o'clock. Extend utmost kindness." When a husband wrote him that his wife was completely destabilized, Shoghi Effendi wrote a cable back and said, "Assure undiminished love, confidence." Shoghi Effendi was also very perseverant. This is the symbol of perseverance, Sisyphus, who angered the gods and punished him by making him carry a boulder up the top of a mountain, only for the boulder to roll down the other side, and he had to do the same thing over and over for all eternity. And he became a symbol for perseverance. The Guardian never, ever, ever gave up. And in many of his letters, the word persevere is repeated many times. Ruhiya Khanum says she never saw him ever give up on anything, whether it was writing a sentence, translating a word, just never. The Guardian's guiding lines, these are sort of his principles. One of them is his stylistic integrity. Everybody knows this story, that an American pilgrim said that ordinary Americans had a hard time understanding his letters and that he should make them easier, like in more simple English. And the Guardian firmly pointed out that this was not the answer. People needed to raise their standard of English. So his stylistic integrity is something that begins with the guardianship and ends with the guardianship and continues on with the House of Justice. We see that same stylistic integrity in the House of Justice. Shoghi Effendi was very intransigent when it came to political involvement. He never swayed on that. It was one of the most strict guiding lines of the guardianship. But he, in addition to that, and related to non-involvement in divisive politics, was his emphasis on unity. His emphasis on unity was the principle of unification which the cause advocates and with which it stands identified. And added to this unity was the concept of unity and diversity, which he promoted throughout his entire guardianship. One of my favorites in this whole section is the Guardian's love for humble Baha'is. I have this painting here of a sifter of wheat as a oblique art reference to the sifter of wheat from the time of the Bab, who made the Bab so happy by his acceptance of the faith. It's this love of simple people that Shoghi Effendi shares with the Bab, Bahá'u'lláh, and Abdu'l-Bahá. This same love of humble, pure-hearted Baha'is. And Shoghi Effendi very much disliked aggressive and ambitious individuals. And this position, this statement makes it the clearest. Not infrequently, nay, oftentimes, the most lowly, untutored, and inexperienced among the friends will, by sheer inspiring force of selflessness and ardent devotion, contribute a distinct and memorable share to a highly involved discussion or any given assembly. Friends, I'm going to skip this last emphasis on teaching because you're going to hear a lot about teaching in this chronology. I have one more thing to tell you, and this is that, hold on. Next week is part 8, 1927 to 1931, the Mansion of Bahji. But guess what? Next week in 1929 is the first cross-Africa trip of the Guardian. I am so excited to talk about that. I can't wait. Please come to this. This is going to be so much fun. I'm done for today. Thank you to all of you on Facebook and YouTube and Zoom. Love you guys. See you next week. Thank you.